todos la más cordial bienvenida a este evento que se dice Libertad, sobre las raíces olvidadas del liberalismo, una conferencia magistral con la profesora Helena Rosenblatt, y le paso la palabra al presidente de SEDICE, Carlos Enrique Bolón. Welcome, Professor Helena Rosenblatt.
Good afternoon. From here, from Caracas, it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Dr. Rosenblatt and Carlos Goder, who will present her. And we in SEDICE are in the search for having more freedom in Venezuela, and to be able to study liberalism and its history is very important for us, and to understand that it is the best way to bring prosperity and freedom and happiness to a country like ours, which is going through a lot of hardship. Carlos Goder is an economist and a marketing master of IESA in Caracas, who has studied also risk, and he's a certified risk specialist. But he's also a senior fellow in SEDICE and has done very important research for the influence, for example, of the COVID virus, and which we call the tyrannovirus, and other very important research efforts that he has done. He's from Medellin, and I will let him introduce Dr. Rosenblatt and her very important book, and enjoy this. This is part of our week of celebration of freedom, because we're celebrating the 31st anniversary of the fall of the Wall of Berlin. So this is an important week for all us freedom-loving peoples. Carlos, please follow.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you so much for hosting from SEDICE this celebration. I think that's the most important thing you have said. It's joy. It's a moment of joy to celebrate freedom, because the cause of freedom may be hard, may be difficult, but it's also pleasant. So we have thanks to SEDICE and for hosting, and after that we have the pleasure to introduce here the work of Helena Rosenblatt. Her book, this is the copy of her book in Spanish, and I must say I have worked hard, full of notes. It's a great book that has been published for the Spanish-speaking world this year, a year that is very tough, as Mr. Blum says, a year that has been where we have faced the risk of returning to some forms of oppression we had forgotten due to this argument that is in favor or to benefit people. And sometimes that may be elusive, so that's why we are worried. In the very first place, I'm gonna give a very short bio of Professor Helena Rosenblatt. I'm going to do a very quick introduction, and we're going to be delighted to hear her. I must say we have talked with her before, and we are sure she will cause a very gentle and provoking effect in the Spanish-speaking audience. We need to talk what she's going to bring to the table. So, well, Professor Rosenblatt has a PhD in European history. He has a remarkable history of publications. This book we're discussing today has been published in the English-speaking world a couple of years ago. We're having it this year, and it's been very successful. It has been sold out. I think it's going to have a second edition very soon. It was released in April this year. The Professor Rosenblatt is working from the Graduate Center in the University of New York. I am sure this, after this presentation, there will be opportunity for some of the participants here to reach her and exchange documentation. She has communication with many people in the Spanish-speaking world, especially in Spain. She has many partners there, and she's very humble because she, believe me, this book, she has collected, I think we should have something like 100 thinkers here, and she has collected and make it very nice to read. So, well, what's the point for this discussion? And we're gonna have Professor Helena with full details. You know, we have been managing perhaps a concept of freedom and liberty that is a little bit narrow. In Venezuela, our country, we have perhaps fallen to a trend that took place worldwide in the last century, given the totalitarianism, given that people suffer so much due to tyrannies. We have focused our freedom and our liberty in our rights, which is good. We must say that we have the right for our private property. We have the right to think independently, freedom of speech, but we have focused too much on the rights, given in part because our rights are in danger, especially in Venezuela, a country where whatever is our political inclination or trend, we know we have repression, and the world is going through that trend. What this interesting conversation is going to bring to the table is that freedom, liberty, and liberalism have wider things to think about. One of the things we have to consider is our relationship of our freedom with the rest of society. And we will see that from the beginning, liberalism was a moral philosophy. And then not all liberals or libertarians, if you want to call it, because we have the trouble with the term in English, think the same. Some people in the history of liberalism are more favorable or like more a free market structure. Some think the government should have some intervention. Others are more open to talk about religion. Others consider that religion could be another form of oppressing or bringing out authoritarian forces to the life of the citizens. So that's what we want to bring to the table. Liberalism has a wide spectrum of things, and it's not only an American creation or a British creation. It has roots in France, Germany. Let's bring them to the table and let's avoid that geopolitical considerations stop from bringing all this magnificent gallery of thinkers and their legacy to our contemporary discussion. Nothing more to say, but thanks to you all. Thank you for coming. Your questions will be welcome. And I insist, we have a very nice speaker who is very gentle, very soft. She will bring to us a lot of ideas and we'll receive our thoughts about them. I hope we may continue talking with her for a long, long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And thank you, Sedice, for inviting me today to speak about a subject that we clearly all feel very strongly about, and that is liberalism. I'm particularly honored to be asked to give this presentation during your celebration of freedom, this special week dedicated to freedom. We live in a difficult time. A liberal democracy is we are living through a crisis of liberal democracy. Freedom House has now offered several reports over the last few years, and it's not getting better. The recent one shows that for the last 14 years, liberal rights and political freedoms are in decline around the world. This is very alarming. And it's perhaps even more alarming that the United States is no exception. We were gladdened to see Trump voted out of office, but we must remember that 70 million people, 70 million Americans voted for him. He received more votes than any president in past history. Fortunately, 70 million, I think. And luckily, Biden received even more than 74 million. But we're also aware that it's not enough to vote Trump out of office. There's much left to do to guarantee our liberal democracy, which has been under attack for quite some time now and is quite fragile, as we have learned. Even more so, of course, because of the horrible COVID pandemic. So I've been invited to speak about my book, and I'm delighted to do so. I thought that I would speak a little bit first about why I wrote the book, very briefly, and then go into what I think the history of liberalism can teach us. You might wonder what a historian can offer today. We're better at talking about the past than predicting the future. But I do think that my book, The Lost History of Liberalism, can offer a perspective, can clarify certain things, and possibly even give us some lessons that will help us through this crisis. More than ever, I think we need to know about the history of liberalism. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that's a nice way of looking at it. So my first two books were on political theorists, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Benjamin Constant. And as I did my research on those two great political theorists, it became obvious to me that there was no history of liberalism available, at least not in English, that covered the kind of time span and that I think the topic deserves. Actually, nothing there pretty much since the 1920s, surprising as that can be. And then, so I thought I'd take up the challenge and try my hand at it. And immediately I realized that there's a problem. There's a problem of definition. There are these different definitions out there about what liberalism actually means, what it is, and how can you write a history of something when there are these disagreements. You may have noticed that in America, in colloquial parlance, liberalism means big government, welfare state, openness to government regulation, whereas in Europe and much of the world, it means almost the opposite, deregulation, free markets, small government. In America, we also have libertarians who say that they are the true liberals, the classical liberals, orthodox liberals. So what are we to do about this? And once again, how do you write a history of liberalism when people can't agree on what really it is? And if you turn to historians and to pundits and political theorists and those who write, they will often start when they talk about liberalism by saying, oh, it's hard to define, it's a slippery concept, it's kind of vague, but I take it to be this. And then they go back in history and they find thinkers and ideas and they kind of string them along so that they add up and justify and support their own definition of liberalism. And this is, not really doing history to me. This is imposing your view on the past and finding and kind of cherry picking what we call ideas and thinkers and politicians that agree with you or whose ideas add up to this thing you call liberalism. So I wondered, how to write this book. And frankly, I started thinking that, all right, well, I'll write a book where I devote a chapter each to the great thinkers of the liberal tradition, maybe John Locke, maybe Adam Smith, and so on. But suddenly I realized, who has decided that this is the canon, that these are the great thinkers? Who decided this? And people have different, they line up different thinkers. Some even talk about Machiavelli, some talk about Jesus Christ. It's kind of all over the place, although most people do give place particularly to the English thinkers, John Locke and John Stuart Mill and so on and so forth. Anyway, meanwhile, I noticed also that people often, at least in America, speak of liberal democracy and liberalism and even democracy as kind of synonyms for each other. So there was this confusion out there. Moreover, it's often a smear word, a pejorative, like an insult. In America, Republicans will call Democrats liberals, and Democrats try to avoid the label. Biden doesn't want to be called a liberal. In France, Macron does not want to be called a liberal. There, it kind of means, it's the pejorative also. It means cruel, heartless kind of globalization and deregulation, whereas in America, it means big government. So there you have it. I wanted to do something different. And I adopted this new approach then, a completely new approach that led to some very interesting discoveries. And what I do then is that I actually let history speak for itself. And I say, what did the word liberal mean way back in Rome? What did It means throughout the ages, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, during the Reformation, during the Enlightenment. How did this word evolve over time before even there was such a word as liberalism, which comes early 19th century and not before? So this is the first chapter is about the prehistory of liberalism, if you wish. And it begins with the fact that the root of the word liberal is liber, the Latin term liber. And we hear quite often that this means freedom. And here I will connect with what Carlos Gueder said, who I should have said right from the beginning that I'm so grateful for his invitation and interest in my work and generous words. That it had a moral meaning too, this word liber. It meant freedom, but it also meant generosity. It meant the proper values of a citizen, a devotion to the common good. The opposite was selfishness. And this more was repeated throughout history, and liberals have, I would say, until really quite recently, and I'll talk about that in a while, emphasize that. They have been moralists. They have been very concerned not just with duties, not just with rights, but also with duties. Human beings have rights, individual rights, because they have duties, so as better to perform these. Selfishness has been consistently pushed away, and and self-interest has often been thought of as a form of selfishness, frankly. So what did this approach then make me realize? What did it teach me? A few very surprising findings. And the first one we can say is that the idea of an Anglo-American tradition is a myth. Often we are told that liberalism has deep roots in English history. Some go all the way back to the Magna Carta of 1215, and then they talk about how it was developed further by somebody like John Locke, a founding father of liberalism. His ideas were basically transported to America, where they were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, and from then on, America exported these principles around the world. Well, if you take my approach and you look at the meaning of liberalism, and you look at how people defined it, and you will see that liberalism actually was first invented, the word coined and theorized in around 1812, and not before. The first theorists were not John Locke, but people like Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël. It referred then to a cluster of concepts that were very important to people at this point in time: the rule of law, civic equality, true constitutional representative government, and a number of rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, very important, and also freedom of property. But this was sometimes even not part of the rights that were mentioned, and often anyway not the primary one. The first liberal party I discovered was actually in Spain, and at the same time pretty much in Sweden, where actually I'm from, so I'm very proud. First liberal parties that called themselves liberal parties and were called liberal parties by others were then in Spain and in Sweden, not in England and Gladstone and so forth. You will, I don't need to tell you about Simón Bolívar and how these ideas then were transported. He spent time, of course, in France under Napoleon. He was a very enlightened man, absorbed these principles and took them elsewhere, and they inspired independence movements in many places. But France was where it came from. People spoke of France being the headquarters of liberalism, for good and for bad. Some people, and conservatives especially, and many others too, were frightened about the French Revolution and successive revolutions over the course of the 19th century. America was really out of the picture, and England too at this point. They weren't there. In fact, the word liberal in its political meaning, which again was quite recent, was often spelled with an E at the end, liberal, or in italics to indicate its foreignness. I'm talking about English language publications, newspapers, and so forth. So it was something foreign and somewhat scary to many people. Now, I want to stress that liberals in this point were not Democrats. They did not stand for democracy. And in many ways, this had to do with the French Revolution as well. Self-titled liberals, those who call themselves liberals and espouse this thing called liberalism, they had seen the crowds in the French Revolution. They had seen the terror, which was also the most democratic time of the revolution. The most democratic period of the French Revolution was also the most bloody time. This is when enemies of the people were guillotined. This is when liberals saw what they regarded as irrational crowds prone to violence, act violently and irrationally and not in favor of their own interests even. So they were very wary of these crowds and wary of the people in general. Then they watched demagogues and dictators seduce the people with their words and with propaganda and cater to the people's lowest instincts. And these people then were distracted again from what liberals thought were the real interests. Although they accepted the concept of popular sovereignty, that governments should be responsible to the people, they did not advocate democracy. From back to the ancient Greeks, democracy meant people power, right? And often, even in the 18th, early 19th century, there was a bit of a confusion. They still did not have our understanding of representative democracy. Often it was thought of something as direct democracy as it was in Greece, ancient Greece. So this is also why liberals were not Democrats at the time. Now, while they all really agreed on saving revolutionary principles such as the rule of law, civic equality, representative government, and these freedoms, they did not always agree on how that translated into policies. They argued about all sorts of things. The size of the electorate, whether liberals should support independence movements abroad and revolutions abroad, how much government should regulate industry and the economy, for example. So liberals were not all of one mind. Liberalism was not one thing. Moreover, it was an evolving thing. What I've just spoken about was the creative moment, the first moment of liberalism, when the word was coined and the liberalism became liberalism and was talked about as such. But it also evolved over time. Liberals were pragmatists. They considered themselves also moderates and centrists, not wanting to continue revolutionary violent behavior and action, but on the other hand, not go back to a counter-revolutionary, to the absolute monarchy that preceded the revolution. They wanted to chart a middle course, and they were pragmatic. So when new problems started to arise in the beginning and towards the end, picking up towards the end of the 19th century in the economy, I'm speaking about the effects of industrialization and urbanization, the growing working class in the cities that were seen obviously suffering. Many were trapped in poverty, living in miserable conditions, a lot of illnesses and unemployment. And many liberals now became interested in some ideas being formulated in Germany about how governments should intervene to help the poor. So now this key notion of generosity and freedom together caused a rearticulation of liberalism. It was now, we need to be generous also to the poor. The government must step in and help them be free. They cannot be free under these situations. And so German thinking helped liberals to rearticulate what they stood for. And you had something called new liberalism. Some people even called it social liberalism or liberal socialism, no contradiction seen there, because socialism was not yet a revolutionary movement. It did not necessarily mean the abolition of private property. It generally meant caring for the poor. What John Dewey, the American philosopher, said in the 1930s, he called it two streams of liberalism now occurred. So you had the one that was more favorable to government intervention, and you had the one that became more extremist, free market oriented, laissez-faire. This is what we hear about. Not all liberals believed in such extreme views. I would say that they took these ideas at this point to an extreme, many of them, and they insisted, we are the real liberals, we are the orthodox liberals. So what I've said now is that liberalism was invented in France and re-articulated with the help of a German thought. This is something that we don't hear, the Anglo-American tradition. There really wasn't one yet. But we now come to the third moment, which is when liberalism was Americanized. And the word liberal and liberalism, meaning political things, really only came to America in the first decade of the 20th century. It was imported into America by intellectuals and political actors who were very friendly to what was going on in England, and in particular this new liberalism, which now no longer people called new, they just called it liberalism. And so you get somebody like a progressive, Woodrow Wilson, who called himself the president, Woodrow Wilson, who called himself first a progressive, by 1917 was calling himself a liberal. So you see this transition and this importation and then dissemination of this political term, meaning what new liberalism basically had meant. And Woodrow Wilson was probably the first to use liberalism in an international context, in a foreign affairs context. So in his Peace Without Victory address, he claimed to be speaking for all liberals and friends of humanity. And when he went to Europe to lobby for his 14 points while en route to the Paris Peace Conference, he said, liberalism is the only thing that can save civilization from chaos. And now we therefore have it becoming something because of World War I, because of the rise of totalitarianism, which is a new word invented in the 1930s to describe what was going on in Europe, fascism, eventually also Stalinism, communism, fascism, Nazism, totalitarianism. For this reason, now America becomes the model and the defender of this thing they increasingly call liberal democracy. And they often use that now unproblematically as if they are the same thing, but they really are not. And their histories are intertwined, but they are not exactly the same. And this is also why, because of World War II, basically, because of the rise of totalitarianism, because of World War II, Germany and France are written out of the history of liberalism. They couldn't possibly have contributed anything. They had, so it was thought or said or assumed. It is now that John Locke becomes a founding father of liberalism. And a certain John Locke too, a certain reading of John Locke is stressed, and one that really accentuates individual rights and property rights to show this is what America stands for. This is what our soldiers are fighting for against the totalitarian menace. We stand for individual rights. They downplayed now the whole idea of devotion to the common good. Remember, I said in the beginning that to be liberal in ancient Rome and throughout history meant also to be a citizen devoted to the common good. But because of the totalitarianism, Americans now and the English too, became necessary to really, they thought this was a little dangerous. It was very important to defend individual rights above all. Remember Friedrich Hayek, and now we're talking about the Cold War. As you can imagine, this language becomes ever more insistent. Friedrich Hayek, the very important, he would call himself a classical liberal now, said this new liberalism, this liberalism open to government intervention, puts us on the slippery slope to totalitarianism. We must stand for the Anglo-American tradition, he says, and others say again, which is all about individual rights. So in the Cold War, this is emphasized more than ever, as the great American philosopher Richard Rorty said, like the history of anything else, the history of philosophy is written by the victors. Victors get to choose their ancestors. So the victory of the two world wars, followed by the Cold War, caused America to choose John Locke and redefine liberalism in a useful way. A liberalism that was all really about individual rights. So now let me perhaps suggest a few lessons that we can draw from this story. First of all, this notion that we have a long Anglo-American tradition that stretches back into history, and that there is a kind of a providential tendency to history. We often hear the words, the march of history, or do you remember Obama used to love to say that a liberal democracy or American principles that he stood for are on the right side of history. Well, if we think that it's so providential and liberal democracy is so obviously correct, so wanted by history, can it not make us complacent? Can it also make us a bit self-righteous? Can it make the young think that, well, you know, do we really need to vote? Do we need to fight for this? Maybe not. It's just going to happen on its own somehow. Well, the truth is, first of all, I told you, the Anglo-American tradition is a recent idea. And secondly, liberals fought. It was a fighting faith. They had enormous and very powerful enemies, and there were setbacks and regressions. They were pursued, they were censored, they were imprisoned, exiled, they were even killed for their beliefs. So there's nothing obvious, nothing easy about this history. It's a fighting faith, and I think it's necessary to remember that. We have to be brave. We have to be resilient. We also learned that there were divisions. Remember, I spoke about how liberals did not always agree on everything. Sometimes that weakened them when they were faced with demagogues and dictators. We're talking about Napoleon I, Napoleon II, Bismarck, sometimes Napoleon III, excuse me, Napoleon I, Napoleon III, and even Bismarck, who appealed directly to the people. And the liberals sometimes thought, well, maybe we can work with them, and others did not. And so they splintered several times, and this weakened them. Especially when they were attacked from both the left and the right, the counter-revolutionaries and socialism at a certain point. Another lesson, populism, the rise of illiberal democracy, as we also call it, would not have surprised liberals. As I mentioned before, they had seen the crowd action. They were very worried about it. They were worried about crowds being seduced. They were gullible. They were easy prey for demagogues and dictators who catered to their lowest instincts, who distracted them with glorious wars, if they could be such a thing, and only to enhance their own power and line their own pockets and those of their own friends. So there is really no liberal during the 19th century, no classical liberal, no liberal there that is very enthusiastic about democracy. In many ways, what they thought about was how to contain democracy or educate democracy. Eventually, they accepted democracy, which of course is a very good thing, but they insisted all the time that we needed an educated citizenry, an educated and engaged citizenry. And that's something I think we have to discuss today, the need for this again. What can we do about this situation today? Again, I'm a historian, but I will at least put it before us that we need to grapple with these issues that are coming up. Not only do we have the rise of populism around the world, and the attack on liberal democracy and all these principles that I've discussed about and that we hold, I've discussed and that we hold so dear, and which has been a recurring problem in history, these demagogues and dictators that come along. But we're also facing enormous unprecedented challenges. I'm talking about the climate crisis. I'm talking about the technological revolution, automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Millions of workers are going to be thrown out of work in America for sure. What are we going to do about this? In America, we're also very worried and concerned about the internet, the polarizing effect it's having in America, the extremist views that it encourages, the fans that and how hard it becomes then to work together to legislate, to deal with these problems I've just discussed. I put before you that liberalism needs to reinvent itself one more time. Liberals have been pragmatists. They have believed in these core principles of freedom and generosity, and they have redefined themselves in a pragmatic way when new problems have arisen. I think this is another moment when we should think about this in order to deal with this crisis and with these growing problems. Finally, as an educator, I'd just like to speak final few words about the need for civic education in our schools. These thinkers I said earlier were real moralists. There's not one of them who didn't speak favorably about education, about the need for education, for public education, and for civics. I believe that today, more than ever, we need to invest in public education, teach students our history, that it's worth fighting for these principles that so many have fought for before us. There is a bit of complacency. There is cynicism on university campuses in America for sure. I face it with my students. I say to them, you don't know how lucky you are. I think this elites have to step up. Yes, liberalism has been elitist in the past. It has been, some instances, even anti-democratic. I've spoken about that today several times. But a lot was expected of the elites. They were supposed to be models. They were supposed to be generous and civic-minded. Many of them took this very, very seriously. In particular, these political leaders. Where has that gone in our world? Where is it? Where are the elites stepping up to provide models and to help in this endeavor? Patriotism doesn't have to be a bad thing. I don't believe it is. There can be a good patriotism. And we mustn't concede this territory, this language to our adversaries, that they are the ones who stand up for the people and for history against the liberal elites and so on and so forth, that they are the true patriots. This needn't be true. It isn't true. And I think we need to combat it. So, and the absolutely final words is what this history also tells us is, yes, America is not the originator of liberalism. It is the most powerful liberal democracy today, and with India, one of the oldest. But it cannot. First, it has to cure itself, and thank goodness we now have a new person in the White House who can. Or he's not yet in the White House, as we all know, but hopefully will be in the White House. But he needs to work together with the world. This is a global problem. Other countries have contributed to liberalism. Others we need all of us to work together to face this crisis. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena, for this really, well, you have done an excellent summary of many ideas, but very clear. So thank you once more. And we are delighted to hear that the first Liberal Party came from the Spanish-speaking world. That's good. And well, I hope that we will also have the chance to have some contributions, and perhaps you take the challenge of a book about the evolution of the history of libertarian or liberal ideas in Latin America. And I'm sure that people here in these countries, we have suffered so much from different forms of repression and dictatorships, and we have so many social challenges that I'm sure we will write interesting pages and add to this wonderful history. So we're going to open now the space for the questions and promote a joyful conversation about the different things we want to share this magnificent book and this really delighting presentation. Thank you so much.
Carlos, están las preguntas en el Q&A. Allí hay 3 preguntas pendientes.
Buenísimo. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have one of the questions says, if liberalism is to be rooted back to its genuine French origins and to its German rearticulation, how should we understand the contribution of the English liberal thought? Are they different interpretative paths or two traditions in conversation with each other? Thank you to Paola Romero for this provocative question. And there are other two, but first we want to handle this.
Yes, I don't think, if I understand the question correctly, I would first say that I didn't mean to say that we should return to the French liberalism or the German form of liberalism. I think we need to come up with a new one, to reinvent ourselves once again, or to reinvent liberalism to deal with the problems of today. And I think certainly the Anglo-American variety that we see today has very good elements, and I think it is the way forward, except I think the more libertarian wing or stream and the other stream need to work together to understand the existential threat that exists today. So I think we need to work together again and redefine democracy. And certainly we would expect America and its allies to play a leading role in this redefinition, this reconceptualization.
Thank you so much. We continue with another contribution from Paola Romero. Thank you. She says, Republicanism seems to be living a revival. Your defense of liberalism, as concerned with generosity and community-oriented values, seems to touch on what Republicans think is distinctive of their position. How do you read this? Thank you. Thank you, Paola.
I'm not 100% sure I understood this question, but let me tell you a little bit about the academic world that I come from, and presumably this is true in the Spanish-speaking world as well. That republicanism and liberalism, I'm now not talking about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I'm talking about the movement of thought that we refer to as republicanism and the movement of thought we call liberalism. These have been traditionally by scholars separated and seen as two conflicting traditions. I mean, there's an enormous scholarship on this, and whether America was originally Republican in orientation or liberal in orientation, and republicanism, and if you're interested, please do email me and I can give you some sources on this. Republicanism then has been associated with those the virtues of citizenship, of devotion to the common good, of political participation, using classic Roman references. Whereas liberalism has been defined in this way that I say, I try to argue is an outcome of the Cold War and a certain reading of John Locke, saying that liberalism means self-interest, kind of rule. And what we need is a government that manages these self-interests and negotiate, and the self-interests will negotiate with one another for the benefit of all. So we have republicanism for political partisan and virtue, and liberalism more business-oriented, more economically oriented, more self-interested oriented. What I've tried to say here, without getting into a lot of academic jargon and references, is that I don't believe that these two are separate. I think it's completely wrong. This is a scholarly kind of affectation, if I may say, that might be interesting to think about, but that never in fact existed. I'm not the only person to say this. Many very reasonable scholars are saying that America originally was both Republican and liberal, in the sense that people spoke about the classical thinkers and John Locke and Christian references were kind of mixed in together, which is something that professors and scholars don't make the story very, very quite complicated. How are people reading the classics? How are they reading John Locke? How are they reading Machiavelli? It was fascinating to see how they were able to jumble together in the same sentence Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke and this one and that one, and have no trouble with that. Whereas we scholars today think, my goodness, Rousseau is in one category and Locke is another. I hope I answered a little bit your question.
Sure you did. Well, we have another question about the freedom of women, which is a topic in your book, which is very seductive. And you explore not only the evolution of how women were treated, most of the time not precisely right, but also you consider the gallery of thinking women who contributed to the history of liberalism. So it's very welcome, this question.
Yes, it is very welcome. I do speak about women and their contribution to liberalism and how male liberals perceived the women's issue. So it's customary again in scholarship to see liberalism in a very bad light, as a sexist ideology, and frankly, most ideologies are said to be very sexist, and there's a lot of good evidence to back that up. But what I say is that yes, most liberals did not overtly advocate rights for women, political rights, civil rights, yes, but political rights, vote for women, that came very, very late, as I'm sure the person who asked the question, knows. And few liberals spoke about this. But there were, all along the way, there were people, liberals, who said, and women who considered themselves friendly to liberalism and no other ideology. They knew on what side progress was. They knew where they had at least possible friendships, and they spoke to the liberals and their male liberal friends. And they say, look, you are not living up to your own principles. Sometimes they call them hypocrites. They said, you talk about freedom, you talk about equality, you talk about rights. Well, how about us? And so feminism, early feminism, tried to ally itself, at least with liberals. And it gave, liberalism, I would say, gave women the language, the concepts to fight for their own rights. Pretty much everyone was sexist, so to say that liberalism is sexist, I'm not saying that you do that. It was a very interesting question, and very good one, but many books are written with the whole point is to say liberalism is sexist, liberalism is racist, liberalism is for imperialism. Well, some liberals, yes, I was saying that many liberals even were, but so was like everybody else. What is particular about liberalism is not that it was sexist, it was how much it wasn't.
Thank you so much. We now go with another question from Mr. David Chavez. What do you think the future of liberalism should be? That is, how to carry out the cultural battle and how to make people see that it is a practical philosophy.
With books like mine? I have to, I suppose, repeat. I hope I don't disappoint this questioner that I don't have specific policies that I can advocate as a historian. But from what I have observed and the little bit that people like us can do, which is not such a little bit, is to educate people to the history I've just spoken to alert them also to the dangers that we face, to look at, to reconnect with the resources of our traditions, to see in the past the mistakes that were made and try not to repeat them, and to find new solutions. This is the issue that confronts us, and for this we need deep conversations, real conversations, not flitting across the surface of things, but really looking deeply at these problems, these systemic problems that need solutions, that mean like-minded people, generous, freedom-loving people, true liberals need to come together and find these solutions and spread the word. You know, I do find, and perhaps I said this before, that there is a kind of negative attitude to liberal democracy. I just reviewed a book called Why Liberalism Failed, which is extraordinarily negative, and so very unfairly so. And this is very unhelpful at this moment, considering that we all profit so much from the liberal democratic system, that this is what makes even this conference possible, my book possible, prosperity possible. But we do have serious problems that we need to deal with, some of which I spoke about in my closing remarks. Certainly the poverty that you are experiencing in Venezuela, and I'm not an expert, but I read about some of these problems, need serious solutions and thinking through, and they need partnerships. They need partnerships and pragmatism, no extremism, no abstract daydreaming about, but really concrete working together policies. That's what I think.
Thank you so much. And indeed, as you mentioned, having your book here for our Venezuelan audience is part of the solution. So thank you so much. It gives us a wide spectrum. From Mrs. Maria Elisa Nunez, we have another question focused on the new liberalism you described, the latest trend, what we call the new liberalism, the Anglocentrical. She says, does this new liberalism means some balance between the individual decision power of people and the non-intervention of the government? Do you want to understand a little bit more about
yes, yes, it's all about balance. Of course, the new liberals were still individualists in the sense that they still believed very much in the rights of the individuals, even property rights. No new liberals today, if you will, the American liberals who are more favorable to a welfare state and to regulation do not deny the importance of individual rights. But they also understand that for people to enjoy these rights in a real way, they also need help from the government often. So yes, the trick is here to find a balance. And there are here honest disagreements between people. The libertarians in America wish to go one route, and the Democratic Party, for the most part, disagrees on most issues, not all. Here we have to find a balance and to work together to find solutions. Clearly, once again, as we meet this huge crisis, not only COVID, but all these, and COVID's going to be around for quite a while, but all the other problems that I mentioned at the end of my speech are going to need balance, clear thinking, cool heads, and bravery.
We have a very nice reminder by Mrs. Teresa Sosa about Bastiat. She asks, she thanks for the understanding of the historical roots of liberalism. And well, she asks, well, is Bastiat, can he be included, this remarkable thinker, between the French thinkers? And she also asks, now focusing on current issues, how do you conceive the program today for a civic education system? She asks about Bastiat, the figure of Bastiat, and how do you think the contents for a civic education program should be? So a brief idea about
okay,
policy.
a few thoughts about that. Of course, Bastiat does feature in my book and was a very important propagandist, perhaps more than anything. He wrote wonderful, funny pieces showing the ridiculousness of certain tariffs. He learned a lot from the Corn Law League in England. He went to visit Britain and had established relations there, and came back to France and became a great advocate of laissez-faire. So yes, he's an important part of the liberal history, the history of liberals, but I would put him then on that libertarian side. I believe that he's still a favorite among libertarians today. He would be in that stream and not the other stream, who would disagree with his solutions to today's problem in the main. I mean, in the main, because he was so much against government involvement in the economy, when most American liberals today believe that the government has to play a fairly major role. How big a role is, of course, always debated. And the second question was about what kind of civic education. You know, these very interesting ideas are being floated and things attempted. I'm not the only one, of course, who is talking now about this civic education. One idea is by someone I can call a friend and an acquaintance, certainly, who's Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan University. And he has encouraged students, I think there's even a program, and he's trying to expand it to other universities, where you encourage students, possibly even giving them university credit, to work on political campaigns, for example. And other efforts can be to community service. So this is civic engagement. But then there's just simply certain university course requirements. You know, I'm a believer by the way, in reading the great thinkers of Western civilization. You're hardly allowed to say that anymore. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but Western civilization courses have been out of fashion for a very long time in America. And what I do often, not this book so much, because it's a different approach, but my previous books where I talk about a thinker, when I talk about these great minds, this is considered old-fashioned, and they're a little bit dismissed as, you know, you've heard the expression dead white men's history. Well, I am completely opposed to that attitude. I believe we need to read them. I think great books should be a requirement, frankly, in schools, universities. I'm saying that people take a course certainly in history, but also in Western civilization, with these ideas, for good and bad. I'm not saying to worship these thinkers, of course not. Also look critically at them, study them critically. There was problems there, they were not perfect, not at all. But I think we've gone a little bit too far in one direction, being too critical, and it's not healthy, and it's wrong. It's frankly anachronistic or historically skewed. So that's a couple of ideas that I would have. The humanities, you know, are really in siege. Money, that's another thing. I'm saying a lot of things in the end are about money. People say it's not, but it's, you know, it often is. We need to invest more in public education, and we need to invest more in the humanities and liberal arts education. People keep talking about vocational training, and of course this is important, but it's not the only thing. We need to train citizens, and liberal arts education, I believe, is a very important beginning for that.
Wonderful. We have another question from Mr. Rodrigo Figueroa. You know, in your exposition and your book, you show the clash between the libertarian thinkers and the governments and the politicians, no? So I think that why he poses this question, he provokes with this question: is it possible that big governments with bureaucrats may, front by themselves, promote the political and economic reforms that are so valuable to libertarians? That's a little bit the question.
Well, the way it's posed, it kind of answers itself. I mean, a big bureaucracy, we all know, can get very clunky and inefficient. So nobody wants, I think, a big bureaucracy. The questioner seems, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, skeptical about the role of a big government. But this is a colloquial expression. I don't really think any liberals, Democrats in America advocate a big government and a gigantic bureaucracy. What they advocate is a smart government. But we need government, and we do need to explain to people why we need government. Look at the COVID crisis now in the hospitals, and you know, the extreme distress of so many of our citizens. I think it shows more than ever. And the handling of the crisis, it shows more than ever that we need competent government, but nobody really wants a bureaucracy. It's needed. You need administrations, you need people working, you need a certain amount of bureaucracy, but hopefully an efficient one.
We have a question that comes from Spain. Someone from Spain says, you know, being called liberal here is not rightly perceived by the government. So this person from Spain launches a question: do we need more education about liberalism? That in part is the reason of this session, but perhaps we can elaborate about the point, how to pedagogically educationally about liberalism.
I'm sorry, I missed it a little bit. I missed
that
a little bit.
Yeah, this person says that in Spain, from Spain, is not very well perceived to be called liberal. So launches a question about the kind of education we need about liberalism, about the concept. How can you do public education about it, more pedagogically about the term liberalism for the audience? Because this person say that in Spain, it is rejected, the term itself.
Yeah, and you know, that's so interesting, and it's so true. I said at one point that it's become an insult. The word, many people shy away from it. In America, you may remember Ronald Reagan at one point said, while he was running for election, he called it the dreaded L word, and liberals immediately shied away. Democrats, that is, and still until today, they're skirting around using the word. They're calling themselves progressive. Very few want to use this term. And what I wanted to say is that actually the word liberalism, originally, it seems the evidence is fairly clear that it was a word first used by the enemies of liberals. Isms in history have generally been invented or coined as pejoratives, as insult words. If you think of Calvinism, Anabaptist, often religious heresies, by the way. And so liberalism was used that way. The noun before liberalism was coined was liberality, which meant, again, freedom, lovingness, generosity, magnanimity. So liberalism, when used by these detractors, these enemies, meant selfishness, anarchism, atheism, perversion, all sorts of things. And you have, throughout the 19th century, I'm sorry to say, this repeated again and again, and by none other than the popes, the Catholic popes, who consistently used liberalism in this pejorative sense, also because they frankly were opposed to freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Clearly, I mean, they said these were liberal ideas, and they would result in chaos, in the destruction of society, so it was said. I can only say that to counter this sort of thing and to educate people about what really, truly liberalism is about, is to have these kinds of discussions. And to know the history, and to make that clear, and to stand up for it, not to accept people throwing the word around like it does. Like they should at least understand what they mean when they use the term, so that we can have real conversations. If you mean one thing and I mean another, like how are we even going to have a fruitful debate? So I think that's that's part of the solution.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I would like to give now a final word to our host, Mr. Carlos Blond, who presides SEDICE and has been so kind to host this event today and this conversation that I'm sure we are just triggering a conversation because we will have new opportunities to exchange. So I would like to give a final word to Mr. Carlos Blond to close this event. I'm sure we will have new conversations. We will promote new exchanges of ideas. So I would like to give the word to him and also consider his opinion, because we are all following the developments in the American policy. Sorry, we are talking about ideas and about your pretty beautiful book, but it's unavoidable to think a little bit about the recent developments of the elections in the United States. So perhaps sometimes we miss, and that's something that we were talking with Mr. Carlos Blom. He was saying, he was thinking about this problem, the politicians today compared to the politicians in the past. So I'm sure he will elaborate a little bit more about this question, because we all follow your nation. Your nation will always be a reference. So, well, I give the word to him. And thanks to you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much, Carlos and Helena, for your presentation. It has been a real pleasure to be able to talk about the history of liberalism. Yes, Carlos was talking about a thing I put up in the chat. In order to lower the level of my nervousness because of the results in the election in your country, I'm sort of watching an old series which I've enjoyed very much, which is The West Wing.
Yeah.
And I've seen about 65 of the 156 episodes in the last 2 weeks. And the contrast between the, if you can say, the Kennedy Clinton Democrats were very civilized, very tolerant. It's like people from another planet compared to what we're seeing now, a more belligerent statist, and even sometimes explaining violence. So I don't want to go into to force you to talk about this, but it is another era. It looks like a long ago era, the 1999, and I really enjoy that series because of that. And then the other thing which I wanted to say is that in our country, I started last week when I had to talk about liberty. I finished my very small short speech with a Latin expression of Thomas Jefferson, which I'm just going to say in English, which is, I prefer a dangerous liberty than a quiet servitude. And this is the way I feel here in Venezuela. And you're very lucky in your country, even with all the partisanship, that you are in a very, very free country.
That is true. And we have to treasure it and safeguard it and fight to keep it, for sure. And let's hope that, certainly I think that Mr. Biden, Joe Biden, is that kind of leader also. I think he speaks he's a gentleman, let's put it this way. And it'll be refreshing to have that kind of person. Of course, nobody can really compete with the soaring rhetoric of President Obama, who was always amazing to listen to, but also very elegant. We really wish we could have someone in the White House that we could look up to, and politicians that we can respect. I spoke a little bit about elitism. There's a good kind of elitism, a good kind of meritocracy, where you really have what Madame de Stael spoke about, which is what we need is government by the best. And I don't mean, some kind of hierarchical or something based on heredity. I'm just saying that we need good, qualified, and yeah, people we can look up to and be inspired by in positions of leadership.
Well, thank you very much again to Carlos and Professor Rosenblatt, and we hope to see you soon in another event.
Thank you, Mr. Blum. It's been my pleasure. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And thank you, Carlos Guerra, too. And thank you to the audience for zooming in today. I can't see your faces, but it's been a great honor and pleasure to talk to you.